I'd just like to take a moment and give a shout out to the George Lunan Foundation. As through their generous donation and support, we're able to offer this series at no cost to our participants. So thank you very much to the George Lunan Foundation. As just a couple housekeeping items, today it's the webinar presentation will happen, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat throughout the webinar, and that way we'll be able to moderate a question and answer. So once again, as you're listening to the webinar today, please feel free to drop a question into the chat to myself, and I'll help moderate and bring those questions forward to both Aaron and Justin. And on that note, just some information on what's up and coming at room 217. I guess the next would be our next webinar scheduled for March 9th will be the amazing Bev Foster, our executive director and the founder of room 217, is going to be walking through quality improvement through MusiCare Certify. And as you know, we've sort of talked a few times about our rebranding and relaunching of our brand new website in the fall of 2021. And just as sort of an overview, we now have 3 pillars of MusiCare where you'll find our programs and products. This is MusiCare Connect, an app that you can download on Google Play or Apple iStore, which gives you access to our products and resources 24/7. And of course, we have MusiCare Certify, a quality improvement program. And we also have the Learn platform, or a hub of learning to build your knowledge and skills. And so I'm going to take a moment just to talk about Learn. Learn is a pay-as-you-go model that gives you access to all of our programs, or you can actually now buy into a membership of our Learn platform. And again, this will give you 30% discount on all of our learning options. An annual subscription to the Connect app actually comes with the Learn membership, and access to 3 90-minute masterclasses per year, which are all part of the Learn membership, and a 15% discount on all store purchases. And so we're thrilled to show you, this is an overview of our Learn educational programming, and really excited to announce that this fall we will be once again offering our MusiCare conference. It'll be hosted in BC and should be hybrid in model. So that's an exciting offering coming up. And also on the 17th of February, we have a masterclass hosted by Taylor Kurta, singer-songwriter and music therapist, and Katya Engel. And this is sort of I guess a giving back to our caregivers. They're going to walk us through a relaxation and creative response to the themes of compassion fatigue. So if you are a Learn or Certify member, you can have access to this free of charge. I should have sent an email to you. If you didn't get one, feel free to reach out. And for anyone MusiCare trained level 1, 2, and 3, it's $15, and you can register online through our website. Upcoming, our MusiCare training is, we have level 1 on February 15th and 16th. We have a level 2 offering on March 24th and 25th, and we have a level 3 starting in April. But today, for the main event, let's introduce Aaron and Justin. Aaron Lightstone is a music therapist and the founder and director of Music Therapy Toronto. He's also an award-winning musician, composer, educator, and researcher. Justin Gray is a producer, a bassist, composer, and educator based in Toronto. He is a professor of music at Humber College. Aaron Lightstone and Justin are the creative leads behind Room 217's third collection of recordings, Diverse Sounds. In collaboration with over 25 musicians from diverse cultural backgrounds, they've created a series of 6 culturally diverse albums to create a calming environment for palliative care patients and their caregivers. They will discuss the importance of cultural diversity and cultural sensitivity in end-of-life care, and present a model for how music creation can provide a template for deep intercultural listening and collaboration in non-musical healthcare initiatives. So welcome and thank you.
All right. Thanks for having us. you. So thanks for having us. It's always a pleasure to speak about this project. It was such a great opportunity and a real joy to create this music for the Room 217 Foundation. I know I can speak for Justin when I say that, and all the other musicians who were involved, because that's something that came across over and over again in working with these musicians, was how much they enjoyed creating these intercultural soundscapes for end of life care. I'm gonna just get that going. So what we did here was the final product is 6 albums, uh, each one representing a very, very broad geographical area that that covers many, many different cultures. And we're going to speak a little bit about how that comes together, because as if we take one example from the 6, Heartbeat, for example, which is sort of meant to represent African music. We all know that Africa is a continent made up of many countries, many cultures, many different languages, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means to create sort of pan-African music with a group of African musicians and ourselves. Um, the origin of this project comes from the fact that Room 217, as you know, if you're here, you know that Room 217 is involved in many different initiatives that are related to the use of music in healthcare. And one of those initiatives is these 12 albums that existed before we got involved, that were designed to be calming music in palliative and hospice care settings for patients and their caregivers. Room 217 created these albums, and they're really beautiful, and they were studied in 2013. There was a qualitative study that was done that identified that just the intentional use of these albums was improving patient care outcomes on several axes, like improved quality of life, assisting in relationship completion, decreasing feelings of isolation and fear, helping meet psychosocial and spiritual needs, and so on. And this was studied in, I think it was 40 sites or something like this. That I can't remember the exact details, but studied in many sites where these albums were being used. But one of the feedback that came back to Bev and her team over and over again was that these albums were very, very culturally specific to um, older adults who were born and raised in North America. And wouldn't it be wonderful if there could be a more culturally diverse offering? That's sort of the backstory. And Room 217 and the leadership recognized that this is a important need to fill, and they had to find creative leads, and they've ended up finding Jess and I, who could take on a project like this. So myself, I come at this with a lifelong interest in music of many cultures. I've been a music therapist since 1999 with 2 music therapy degrees, clinical internship in inpatient mental health, then some work experience in ethnomusicology, folklore research, palliative care and dementia care work at Sunnybrook. My current practice focuses on neuro rehabilitation, but I also work as a professional musician in the world music, the global music community of Canada, with some with the band Jaffa Road, which I founded, and we've done some touring, and we've been recognized with some prestigious awards and so on. And it was back in 2012 that Bev first approached me with the idea of this project, and in 2018, when like a solid plan and fundraising had sort of come together, and I said yes right away, but that this is too big a project for me to lead by myself. So I'll let Justin sort of just introduce himself and why, and you'll see why I wanted to have him work with me as the co-creative lead on this project.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think that's it's great to have the context as to what the purpose of the project was to start it off, because of course the why is such a big factor here. For myself, I definitely started out in my career, and for a number of decades now have been a performing musician as a bass player. Although I started out with jazz music and studying that music here in Toronto, my path took me to uh, India very early on, which is where my cultural heritage is. My mom was born there, and studying traditional Indian classical music for quite a number of years, where I actually invented an instrument called the Bass Veena, and have, but due to just who I am and my interests in creative music and contemporary music, um, I found that after that period of time of sort of synthesizing jazz, my jazz background and Indian music background, I've had the just true pleasure of really associating with the world music community here in Toronto, which is one of the world's largest and most diverse musical communities in the world. And so having the chance to play a lot of music from around the world, South American music, African music from various countries, music from Cuba and the Caribbean, jazz music, R&B music. So as a bassist, uh, and where that transition to, which is very, very important for this project is, and where I'm sitting now is in my studio. I'm a mixing and mastering engineer. And so very, very passionate about sound and about capture. And of course, when we're talking about making a recording of something, it's different than if we were to have live musicians in the room to create these soundscapes and these collaborations. And so being able to conceive how not only what the project would entail in terms of what is the music, but also being able to work with Aaron and work with the whole team to conceive how will we make this into a recording that will be meaningful and be able to translate all of these intentions that we sort of put into the plan into a recorded facility. So right back there where you can see on the other side of this room is where all of the music, except for a couple isolated elements, which will probably come up, was recorded. And sitting right in this chair is where it was all mixed and mastered. So the combination there of music production, music performance, and I'd say the last sort of part of the triangle is also my background in ethnomusicology, which is the study of the music of the world. And that came in very, very important to both Aaron and I and Bev and the entire 217 team in regards to designing an equity plan and looking through the lens of equity, diversity, inclusion and belonging, EDIB, as it's, we're all surely very aware of at this stage, and the importance of it, but designing a plan, which I think will come up in further slides. So that's a little background on myself and how I integrated into the start of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've got two folks were composers. Justin's an expert mixing, mastering, and engineer, and very importantly, and the music therapy background that I bring, and Justin's ethnomusicology expertise certainly all just really, really came together. Because as you'll see, wasn't just about creating the music; it was also about creating a process, which we're going to speak about. And these were some of the really important questions that we had to sort of tackle right at the beginning. Like, what does it mean to do this with authenticity? To do this with a very high level of artistic integrity and academic integrity, as Justin was alluding to. Out of the all the possible cultures that we could be connecting with and making music with and making music for, which ones? That's a big, wide open question. What is the meaning of soothing sounds at end of life in different cultures? Like, we have this idea that certain sounds are soothing, and one of the questions we had going forward is like at the beginning, I mean, was, to what extent is that even like a, a universal concept or not? And when we talk about culturally specific music, what does that even mean now in 2022? It was 2019, 2018 at the time. But what does that mean in a globalized, digital, post-internet, post-YouTube world? And I put like post-YouTube in there because now people still are very much enmeshed in their cultures of origin, but the internet and the way that art, culture, and proliferates on the internet means that people can really be exposed to anything and everything, and geography isn't quite the barrier that it once was. Um, so how are we going to bring all this together? How are we going to do it in an authentic way? And how are we going to connect with the people that we want to make this music with, and the communities that we want, that we think we should be making this music for, and how does that all tied together? And I think hopefully as I say that, you might start to sense what the some of the complex issues are in doing that. Justin, do you have anything you want to chime in with as I
Yeah,
ponder
absolutely.
some of those questions?
I think what's especially important here is, and I'm, I can't speak for all of you, but surely in your professional environments, everybody has been, uh, if not already aware for decades, as hopefully we have been, but in the last number of years, the discussions around authenticity, the discussions around equity, the discussions around the, ways in which we can express things in a diverse way and in an equitable way, are multi-layered, and the intersectionalities that exist with each of these topics is truly, it's very dense. And so right away, what was very important in one of the first conversations that we had with Bev Foster and Aaron and myself, was regarding that before we could move forward, these things had to be defined, and not defined as though we could put them in an encyclopedia, but defined for this project. And it's so important to remember that the word authenticity, the word diversity, et cetera, each of these terms is so multifaceted that it can't be necessarily defined in a unilateral way, but it did need to be defined in the context of this project. And so we spent some considerable time allowing for those discussions to happen, consulting with people who was necessary right at the very beginning, to be able to ensure that every step following that was built on a foundation that would lead to success. And I think that so often when we get excited about making a project, we just want to move forward. We just want to make it happen now. Oh, we know the musicians, and yeah, let's just get this done. And so it was very powerful and very appreciated. It was greatly appreciated that the project was given the space to make that plan. And surely that's where these slides and that exploration will go. And so even though we're describing this one very specific plan, I guess what I intend to say is what matters most is that we look at the universal elements of this system or this approach that could be applied in any way. And it always starts with being patient and actually defining those challenging topics and having challenging discussions around what the parameters are that will lead to that success.
And at the end of the day, it all sort of comes back to the intention of the project, because we were tasked with not just making calming music or relaxation music, because there's lots of great stuff like that out there, but culturally specific, intercultural music for care settings, and culturally appropriate materials, whether it's music recordings or pastoral care or whatever it is in a healthcare setting, when it's culturally appropriate to the individual patient or patient groups. This is a vital piece of making people feel supported. And there's a high risk that the parameters for, without thinking about these things consciously, there's a high risk that the parameters for appropriate behavior, cultural and aesthetic norms determined by the dominant culture, without adequate consideration for what might be different norms operating within particular minority cultural groups. And so there was also a realization that by only going back to the initial intention, that even just the initial library that Room 217 had, which was created from the wheelhouse that the folks at Room 217 had at the time, and that's great. You can't expect people to work very far out of their wheelhouse. So they created this thing, this product, but now there's this need that's saying potentially, well, if we don't have other cultures represented, there's a risk that just the presentation of that and that alone could make people feel less supported, or that their cultural needs are not being met. At the same time, there's a very important paradox to recognize here, which is that we're at the same time, we're, even though we want people to see themselves reflected in the offerings, we never assume that the music that people want is the one that's most strongly identified with their culture of origin. This is such a crucial point, and if you get one thing out of this presentation, I think this is it, because I think in sometimes in music care and in music therapy, it's easy to slide into stereotypes around musical preference. You know, that the African music is made for the African immigrant community, and the Indian music is made for the Indian music community. But it really doesn't work that way, especially in this globalized post-YouTube cultural environment where everybody can be exposed to anything. You know, and as an example, my Jewish mother, born and raised in Canada, says that by far the African one is by far her favorite in the whole collection, right? So we can't ever assume that people's cultural identity is going to be strongly related to their preferences with this stuff, but it often is, and it is a good starting point. So it's a paradox that you need to constantly be aware of. Music is somehow going to start right with the next slide. So I'm going to just talk about, oh, Justin, did you have anything you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, I think that's it was such an important point. And I remember when you brought that up, being reminded of that. And so one of the other sides of having diverse offerings in music is, especially when it comes to what music's purpose is here. Music's purpose is not for entertainment. Music's purpose is not for, financial success and fame and all the things that some recordings are intended to do. It has a very specific purpose in a healthcare setting. And so the other beauty, of course, is that a more diverse sonic landscape, even if we take culture out of it, just the idea that these different cultures will naturally bring different musical approaches, is that each of those offers something different. And so just as you said with your own mom, Aaron, is that someone in a healthcare setting, an end of life care setting, might find great comfort in one of these many options, and they can be completely unrelated, and often are. And I think, as we'll see as this presentation goes on, many cultures around the world, if not all of them, have had, especially the deep-rooted cultures, have explored this same thing, because as humans, we all deal with this situation of end of lives and the idea of music being a part of our communities. And so there's so much intersectionality there, and it's very important to consider all things through that lens, and the fact that we can get very stuck thinking that this fits here and this fits here, but when we break that away, we start to see all of the real benefits that can come from something like this.
Yeah, I think it's a great I mean, it might be a little bit of a cliche, but it's a great example of this, the way that the diversity makes all of us richer, because we all have now the access to this. And and it allows people to sort of move and think in this cross-cultural way. Like my mom loves the African one, and maybe someone from India loves the indigenous one, and an indigenous person loves the India one best, like, and it just, or different moods for different times. So we've got this tall order, and we've got a bit of a precedent in terms of the previous library, because the previous library was made with the idea that Room 217 is curating this playlist, and they had previously identified, I'm going to actually hopefully play this not too loud while I speak, that familiar music.
Just turn it down a little bit, Aaron.
Familiar music, familiarity is a very important ingredient. Slow, around 60 beats per minute. elastic phrase endings and Western musical instruments. And few instruments at any one time. Like, few instruments. One of them is piano, which is a very, as you know, a very full-voiced instrument. But this was the sort of general parameters that we sort of inherited and we began to work with from the previous project. And now we're tasked with figuring out how are we going to translate this into something that sounds like African music, something that sounds like Indian music, East Asian music, Middle Eastern music, and so on. So we developed some focus groups, which we're going to speak about.
And Aaron, just
yeah.
And the next time, even turn it down just a bit more. But I think just since it's so important to again contextualize the fact that those decisions on the previous slide about 60 BPMs per minute, low density, meaning only a few instruments at a time, elastic phrase endings, that those were not just decisions, aesthetic decisions. Those are based on some science and some research as to the musical parameters that were serving best patients in end-of-life care settings. And so that is based on research that 217 had done for years, not only through tons of recordings, but also through live practice and experts in the field, knowing from personal experience that these types of musical parameters, especially to do with tempo, I'd say the tempo is the biggest one. The speed has a direct effect. And this is something that has been recognized in healthcare settings and outside of healthcare settings, just in music in general around the world, that the tempo and density, and therefore the density being the dynamic range, will affect people's emotions. And so this is just so important to identify that this information was not just based on making something sound nice for that particular piece of music, but rather making sure that an entire collection of music was able to consistently provide these key parameters.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a neurobiological phenomenon. We know now that through all kinds of neuroscience in music, which is a whole other presentation, that the tempo and the rhythm has a very, very powerful and measurable neurobiological effect. So thanks for that reminder. So it quickly became apparent that the model of familiar Western music, obviously we're not dealing with Western music in this, and familiar songs that in the previous collection and the other collection 4 that was happening concurrently with ours around boomer popular music, Room 217 did a lot of surveying and making lists of what familiar songs should be used. But of course, in our project, the idea of familiar songs would be an impossible and never-ending task. How are we going to deal with familiar songs from all these possible cultures? How would you possibly choose? So it became apparent, and partly through our focus group process, which I'm going to speak about in a minute, that the guiding principles would be carefully crafted compositions that have lots and lots of room for the expert musicians who are collaborating with us to improvise over structures that, as the composers, we create, and then the session musicians who we brought in would improvise in a very sort of calming, slow moving style. That we would use master musicians to collaborate with us in the expressed culture. But then there's still this important aspect of what's the role and meaning of familiarity. We have this sense that it's very important, but we're not going to use familiar songs. So part of the focus group process was to determine, what are the iconic, soothing instruments and musical bits of musical language that could be used within each of these broad cultural groups. And I say broad cultural groups because, as we've identified, we're kind of looking at this thing on a continental basis, right? So we know there's many distinct cultures and distinct kinds of music in Africa or within India and the surrounding areas, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, those areas. But even though there's all these distinct musics, because they come from the same place and cultures that are related to each other historically and geographically, they do have common instrumentation, common musical languages, common musical paradigms. And one of the questions we asked of every focus group is, was the question, like specifically, like, do you think we can make pan African music of this sort in the case of the African group? And we had all kinds of questions for these focus groups, which were made up of very, very knowledgeable musicians and caregivers from the respective cultures. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. Justin, I'm sure you have something to.
Yeah, I mean,
there.
to go to the guiding principles, I'll even point out that there were essentially a focus group to come up with those principles. So it's important that when we're designing the foundation for a system or a practice, that every decision that goes in, especially at core decisions about what is a composition, what is the role of improvisation, why is that important, who should the musicians be, and why is that important? And I'll talk about each of those for a second here. In a lot of context, the easiest solution here to completing the project, which in a lot of logistical settings, it would make a lot of sense to say, okay, we have a project, we want to complete it, and then we're done. That's how a lot of commerce works. It's a very common practice. We demanded and were supported by Bev and the whole 217 team to have the time, the space, and the resources to take the time to design and confirm these things. So the idea, for instance, that, when it came to familiarity, I can distinctly remember very specific discussions with musicians from multiple cultures around the world and master musicians just in their own right, regardless of their cultural backgrounds, talking about the challenges, the benefits and challenges of using familiar music. As an example, with an Indian background, if we were to choose a popular Bollywood song that would be recognizable to somebody in, let's say, Southwest India, so the Mumbai area, but at the same time, someone in the northeastern part of the same continent would have no recognition of that song. It wouldn't mean the same thing to them. And so suddenly we found ourselves saying that if we are going to make 6 albums, and yes, would we love to have made 70? Absolutely. Would we love to make a Bengali one, and we can also make one for Uttar Pradesh, and we can make one for the South, for Chennai, like, of course, but limitations are real, and we have to, like, looking at limitations rather than looking at them as a barrier, we look at them as a structure. And within that structure, we do the absolute best that we can to maximize the potential of that structure. And so confirming that there would be compositions, well, that was related to the fact that there would be separate pieces of music. We had a conversation about, should we make 60 minutes of straight music? And because of the framework of how we talked to caregivers who said, no, we prefer to be able to make playlists of different songs that suit our clients. So it's a lot easier for us to have a 7 or 10 or 5 minute. So that was part of that decision. The familiarity thing, we realized that after a number of conversations and serious consultation, that creating new music, which did not use any specific referential melodies, i.e. a Bollywood song or a Middle Eastern Arabic classical song or a traditional Peruvian folk song, that not only was that complicated because of an authenticity standpoint, it was also complicated because it wouldn't serve everybody the best. And so all of these decisions were made with serious consultation and a lot of time, where we would have loved to just get the process started and get recording. This is months of work. This is months of holding back from starting the process and making sure that the foundation and the philosophical foundation was going to lead to a successful project that everyone could reflect on, having succeeded in being authentic and in being equitable. And the last one that I'll put there is that improvisation, when we think about an artist, it doesn't matter where they're from in the world, improvising, what improvisation means, like, for instance, what I'm doing right now, I'm not reading from a script, you probably know that by now, is I'm improvising. And therefore I'm speaking my own thoughts, I'm speaking it in my own language, and I'm speaking authentically to myself. When a musician improvises, they do the same thing. And so when we write a melody for someone, we're giving the constructs of a composition, and that's important. It gives framework and for all the reasons that I described. But the improvisation part, but Aaron and I's love for and respect for improvisation was specifically to offer as much time as possible for every artist involved to be authentic to themselves and to get to speak their musical language in their own way. And so again, none of these decisions are made quickly and without consultation. And whether these specific decisions would be correct for another project, it's hard to know. But what is important is knowing that each of those decisions is made carefully and with a lot of specific intent.
Great. So, over 25 musicians representing numerous cultures played on the album. That's just the musicians who played on the 6 albums. Additional musicians and healthcare experts, cultural insiders, and elders, all from different cultures, participated in the consultative process. This is just a photograph taken in our first focus group, and I show you this just to give you a sense of the caliber of informers that we had to work with, and it was a real honor just to sit in conversation with these folks. These meetings lasted 3 or 4 hours, where we asked specific questions that we felt we needed to know in order to proceed, and we just engaged them in a rich discussion. And before I forget, I'm just going to back to the previous slide. Justin said something about composers, and yeah, as composers, we just backtracking before I forget, one rule that we made for ourselves and we successfully adhered to, and I think this was important, was it would have been easy for us, as Justin said, just as like, let's just do it. Like we're musicians, we got this gig, we want to play, let's just start recording. But we made a rule for us that we would not start any composition or any writing until for a particular album until after the focus group had taken place. And that was, I think, ended up being an important rule to start with. So in the focus group centered around Indian music, we had a great musician, Subha Sankaran, who's a master musician, vocalist in her own right, a real expert in Indian music, and daughter of a internationally known Indian percussion master who lives here in Toronto, Trishi Shankran. Gary Diggins, who's a sound therapist and trumpet player and very knowledgeable about Indian music. There's other people who aren't in the photograph, Gurpreet Chana, tabla drummer, and Justin, of course, and Anwar Khurshid, a Pakistani sitar master, and representing caregivers and professional palliative care practice was Dr. Sandy Buckman, who at the time was the incoming president of the Canadian Medical Association and a real expert in palliative care. And we didn't invite him because of his background in Indian culture, but because it was our very first focus group, and we wanted that kind of representation of just medical practice. And it was an extremely, extremely rich discussion. And we duplicated that focus group process with representatives relevant representatives from each of the representative continental groups. And then sometimes there were also additional just one-on-one consultations, because somebody couldn't make it to a focus group, but they still had important things to tell us. So that, and it's important to note, like I said before, there was no composing of music or musical structures until for an album until these meetings had taken place. Anything you want to add to that idea, Justin, before I move on to the next one?
I mean, I'm sure that this is going to also come up, but one of the aspects here, again, as a part of time, is also budget. And part of, just so everyone is clear, every participant for the focus groups, I mean, for the entire project, and this will come up later, I think, Aaron, right? So I won't go too much into it.
Say it now.
But those participants were invited and compensated, well above what was considered the bottom, we wanted to make sure that when experts are coming and sharing, the word appropriation comes into play. The word appropriation is again, a multi-layered, extremely dense word that is contextualized differently in different places. But a quick overview of appropriation is usually that a dominant culture takes information or takes intellectual property or some practice from a less dominant culture, or at least in this context, and then uses it for personal gain or financial gain or economic or power gain. And so in a context where we as facilitators and project managers and 217 as the project, the overall project producers are bringing in these experts and welcoming their knowledge. Of course, all of that's been done in the way that we've and creating these healthy dialogues. It's also important to remember that what they're offering to that meeting, is invaluable. It's invaluable sharing. And we cannot separate the fact that their time and their knowledge, it has to be compensated in some way. Now, compensation is a complicated thing, but in its simplest form, it is often in a capitalist society equated to financial resources. And so each of these, we even had consultations to decide what the hourly rate should be for all of our consultants, making sure that everybody who came into those meetings felt before they even came to the meeting that they knew that they were going to be fairly treated across the board, not just for their thoughts and the ability to share, but that, and ultimately, I don't know if we'll get into the specifics of exact budgets, because again, that's just this project and every project is different. But Room 217 had the responsibility to come up with a significant budget just to healthily and equitably facilitate these meetings so that appropriation was not taking place. Now, appropriation can also take place in other ways, but at least from a financial appropriative practice, we wanted to ensure that the entire project avoided appropriative practices. And so that was just one element to sort of bring to the table. And, sometimes financial resources and money and things can be challenging to discuss, but they are a part of the process. And they were a huge part of the entire project, and something that Room 217 was quite admirable in terms of the resources that they created to make sure that this could be, this process could unfold in the way we're describing.
Great. So I'm going to come back to this slide if we have time. And I'm going to just show a couple of video vignettes. They're each about 30 seconds long, where you can see musicians recording. And I'm going to I want to give you a sense of what the music sounded like. Some of these are recordings while it was in process, so you'll hear the music that was in the musician's headphones unfinished as they were actually recording it. And there's a couple cases where you're actually hearing the final product, where I was able to sync it up with their performance. But I've just pulled a few of these experts out because I want to show you the caliber of individuals that we were working with, and highlight some of the things that we learned specifically from them, so you can get a sense of how each cultural group, each continental group was its own sort of entity, and how we were informed by this consultative process. So in this video, you will hear Ernie Toller, who is a real expert musician in Arabic music, and I picked this example. So I'm gonna play it while I speak. Just tell me if the volume is good for speaking and listening. Is that good? Okay. So this was an interesting example for me because the underlying rhythm of this song, the 6/8 rhythm. So I have this amazing friend, oud teacher, an Iraqi Israeli oud master. His name is Yair Dalal. He lives in Israel, and he was a member of our focus group for Middle Eastern music. And he said, and the Middle Eastern musicians were really interesting in the sense that the focus group focused on they wanted to talk about very, very specific musical elements that they thought we should use, as opposed to, say, the focus group of Indian musicians who were very interested in talking about really like high level, more like philosophical concepts. And I thought that was a kind of interesting juxtaposition. Yair Dalal said, remember that song Perfume Road Lullaby that we played together all those years ago? And I said, yeah. He said, well, you must use that rhythm from that song, which is this rhythm. And somebody in that group said, use the nai, this beautiful bamboo reed, woodwind. George Sawa, who you'll see in another video, was in that group, and he talked about very, very specific musical maqam modal structures from Ottoman music that he's an expert in that should be used. So all of these and that nagma, who you're going to see in another video, should just play very, very sparsely and softly on specific drums. So they gave very, very specific musicological advice. Justin, I'm just going to move through as many as we have time for, but just jump in if you feel like you got anything.
Yeah, just to that point, I mean, we won't go into all of that musicological advice, but just again, to bring to focus the collaborative aspect of this. This music that we just listened to, which is based on a diverse range of Middle Eastern classical approaches to composition and improvisation. Aaron has the expertise in that music to perform it, to compose it. In the Indian context, I have that expertise as well. Combined, I also have played and played in really legitimate settings of African music and South American, Caribbean-based musics. Both of us, as we'll come to the Indigenous Project, had less personal experience there. But regardless, what I mean to say is, despite Aaron and myself having some forms of legitimate expertise in these musical areas as composers, performers, and producers, again, one of the rules was it can't just be our perspective being put into this music. Let's say we're writing for a film. Say we're writing this music for a movie. This type of process would not be, it's not typically supported. The idea is, let's get the music done as quickly as possible and let's make it appropriate for the film. And yes, that absolutely serves the film. But what I mean to say is, despite the fact that we could have just decided between the two of us, you know what, these particular scales will be great, these instruments will be great, the discussion and the open table to those focus groups that Aaron was describing was an opportunity to also diversify our own aesthetic preferences. Our own aesthetic preferences would naturally be the ones that we like the most. But the goal here is to make something that is universal in its nature, as much so as possible. Of course, that is an impossible mountain to truly ever summit, but to try and create something as universal as we are capable of. And that is a collaborative process. And so when George says, use this rhythm, or Nagme says, I'd like to use this drum, because this drum to me represents the feeling that you're trying to get out of this project, then we listen. And that created the framework to then go and compose with, just to sort of recontextualize what you said.
Yeah, so you mentioned Nagma, so I'm going to play this clip, just a little clip. Nagma is a master percussionist living in Toronto. She came to Toronto from Tehran about 10 years ago. And I met her very, very shortly after she arrived here. And she's also the daughter of a very well-known master percussionist in Tehran. And this drum, the zarb, oops, well, hit the wrong button. It just has like this really calming, purring sound to it. And so it allowed us to sort of create, again, like this idea of a pan-regional aesthetic. Persian percussion with Arabic oud and Turkish clarinet and Arabic nai, flute. Miriam Toller, we saw Ernie Toller a moment ago. Miriam's a fabulous Egyptian Canadian singer who sang on the few tracks on the Middle Eastern album that had vocals. this slide. So the African group had a very, very rich discussion. They all did. And the reason I show this clip is just again to demonstrate that, and I'll play it while we talk. So Moyo is a musician from rural Zimbabwe. He was really, really familiar with the way that music is used in health and healing.
And just turn it down a little bit, Aaron.
Bereavement and music for the care of the dying in his culture, in Shona culture in Zimbabwe.
Even more.
Okay. He also has after he came to Canada, he acquired a PhD in social work, and he's a professor of Indigenous Studies at Centennial College. And so not only was he a great musician to collaborate with and create this beautiful music with, but he was also a very knowledgeable sort of cultural informer to tell us important things about what it means to make music that sounds like African music for a project like this. We already heard Nagma, so I'm going to skip over that other one for time. It became important, or became a point of discussion in, I think, almost all the focus groups, that there should be vocals. Except the Asia group rejected the idea of vocals, so that album's completely instrumental. But the idea was that there should be vocals. Was frequently suggested, but every focus group that suggested vocals suggested that there shouldn't be any use of recognizable language. So the South American one and the Middle Eastern one, and the used just the singers doing ahs, and the Suba co-wrote a piece with us for the Indian record, which was using the Indian version of solfege singing and ahs. And Kobena, who this amazing musician from Ghana who collaborated with us as a co-writer and a guitarist and a vocalist, he just started improvising these syllables that kind of sound like language, but aren't. And then he wrote them down so that he could remember them, and he layered beautiful harmonies and so on. So let's just check him out in action here. All right. So, is this a duplicate slide? Yeah, it is. Okay. Just thinking. I always over prepare for these things. I always have more slides to share than what we end up having time for. But I'll play this one. Hold on. It's in my room, I think. George Sawa was one of our Middle Eastern consultants and master musician. He came here in the 70s to Toronto to earn a PhD in ethnomusicology, and he's a real expert on Ottoman music of the 17th century. He's also the translator of the Grand Book of Songs, which is a 9th century treatise about music in Baghdad, which includes many passages written by a musicologist from 9th century Baghdad named Al-Farabi, who wrote all kinds of really interesting stuff about music in healing and in Arabic music. I took Arabic music lessons from him many years ago, and you'll just wanted to give you a little sense of the type of playing that he offered to the project. treat to work with George and record with him. I'm going to, unfortunately, okay, I'm going to skip
Aaron,
this one. Yeah. Go ahead, Justin. Yeah.
just based on, as I look at the time and knowing what the time limitations are, most likely the next going to slide 39 and discussing that to close it up is appropriate.
Right. I just want to yes, I agree. I'm just going to just comment on this slide and why it's here. Aqua, who Nebi Wawaskone, who is singing here, I'll play it while I speak. For the sake of time. One of the things that's important to note is how each focus group had a slightly different outcome. Whereas, for example, in some of the groups, people said, gave us all kinds of advice and said, go write the music and then have us come play the recording sessions. But I want to co-write something with you. And we'll record one at a time. With the group representing Indigenous Canada, for all kinds of different reasons, it was felt to be important by that group that we should have everything should just be more co-written, and that we should record together at the same time in a bigger recording studio than what Justin's space could accommodate. And so I just wanted to use that as an example to show that. And Justin, what slide number did you suggest jumping?
Well, just because I think we have done the what we've done part, but because I think that the 6th album we saved for last because it was related to the cultural music that Aaron and I had the least experience making ourselves. Now, not to say that both of us don't have many close friends and colleagues who are Indigenous musical artists, but neither Aaron and I have expertise as Indigenous artists. And therefore, we wanted to save it for last specifically because it was something that we wanted to bring as all of the knowledge of the project to. And due to, especially when we are talking about cultural appropriation, which is a constant risk in a project like this, it also took us at least 6 or 8 months while these other projects were going on to get the focus group and to get everyone actually on board to be able to discuss this project, because there are a lot of barriers that have been put up because of previous appropriative practices to the Indigenous communities in Canada that have led to a fear of appropriation. And therefore, we were very sensitive to that and spent a lot of time just developing relationships and trust around individual discussions, some of which were not all of which were insightful, but even challenging discussions against to the idea of how is this possible? How can Room 217 and us as Caucasian Canadian members of a music community co-produce an Indigenous-based musical project? And so there were multiple focus groups. There was lots of different perspectives brought to it. And that led to one of the most important parts of it was that the ownership of the music and the creation of melody for the music was not something that we could compose ourselves and then give to somebody, but rather that it would be composed by Aqua, and she would bring those melodies to the group, and then we would collectively collaborate. And so just creating safe spaces for people to be able to be authentic and to feel as though what they're offering is going to represent the music that they wanted to. It just, again, that one was, we could have an entire discussion and multiple discussions just around the process that came to it. But what is most important here is the intent behind it and the patience required and the challenges required in finally getting to the point where we were all in the studio together, making music in a way that made everybody involved feel authentic to themselves and authentic to the music they were making, and that the music was ultimately going to not only respect the cultural source that it was coming from, but also serve the nature of the project. So it was really, I think, an all-inclusive part of our project was making that last record. And we're truly grateful that we were able to get it done before the pandemic began, because it had to be created in the same room. And it was only months later that we would not have been able to be in that space. So
A month. It was February 2020, the recording
yeah,
session.
so very serendipitous in that way. But anyways, I think just to bring to focus that particular project and just constantly, as whoever is in charge of a project like this, and not whoever's collaborating in a project like this, we just have that responsibility to constantly challenge ourselves to do the best that we can. And it happens throughout the project, all the way from the beginning to the end.
And if I could, we have one question. I want to say thank you. We're at our hour time, but there is a question from the community that came up that I think would tie everything in from the caregiving side. And so the question is, how is this music received by families, patients, and healthcare professionals? Do you have any connections or stories relating to that side of the music you created?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, to be honest with you, I think specific to that question, I think Room 217 people in your office would have more information about that than I do personally, because we made it, and then Bev and team sort of put it out in the world. But what I can say is that every musician who was involved in recording this music specifically wrote to us or said to us how much they appreciated to be involved in a project like this that wasn't about entertainment, that it was about music and healthcare, and that really resonated with the musicians. And so I can say that I've had a little bit of opportunity to use it in care settings, but not a whole lot. But but the response that I've received has been quite favorable. But I think that the real answer to that will come once Room 217 gets more feedback on it. And Don, you might actually have more access to that than I do.
Yes, thank you for that, and we will update as we do that. If we could, just because we're over time, is it possible for folks to turn their cameras on and just get a picture? Or if you have a final thought, Aaron and Justin, I want to thank you for being here, and maybe a final thought, and then we could grab a picture.
So the final thought, I think, is just this last slide, which is a bit of a question and maybe a bit of an answer. And we've prepared a academic paper around this question that will hopefully appear soon in a peer-reviewed medical journal. But our hypothesis is that this kind of process that we engaged in, where we gathered all of these experts, and with sincere honesty, we were just like, we really, really wanted to know what their thoughts were and how their knowledge would contribute to this process. And there was like a real intention and process that was created, not just to create the music, but around this deep listening and acknowledgement of all these different bits of cultural knowledge and cultural information. And we think that is potentially a prototype for other forms of important intercultural collaboration and intercultural listening that needs to happen in healthcare settings beyond a musical project such as this. And as a music therapist, we often talk about how music is like this prototyping laboratory. Like, we can create therapeutic change and behaviors that we want to push forward, or that drive therapeutic change in music, and then have them happen in the non-musical context. That's like a big idea in music therapy, and we think this is almost like meta music therapy, right? Like that this process of musical creation might be transferable, or it is transferable potentially, to non-musical projects where this kind of deep intercultural listening and collaboration is going to benefit patients in healthcare outside of musical projects.
Yeah, and I think just to close, that's all totally in line. I love that, Aaron. I think that the questions around how is this being received and how is it being used are the questions, and those are the next questions, and they're the most essential not to close this loop, but to bring a full circle to this process. Our role in this process was to help facilitate the music in the ways that we've described. But now it is time, like for Dawn and everyone from 217 and beyond, for all of you who are in this field, to continue to reflect on how music like this helps. Because not only can we learn a lot from what was successful, but it also will continue to lead towards even furthering the process, finding more parameters that can create music that is providing that environment that was the goal for end-of-life care settings and other healthcare settings. So I think that data collection is really important, and it's something that I personally would be continually, if to start on another project like this, it would be the first thing that I would want to ask for, is what worked. You know, we have a lot of visions of how it worked as a process, but how is it received? What is working? What could be ameliorated or made better, so that the process continues and so that the growth continues.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to both of you. Aaron, I'm just wondering if you stopped your screen share, if folks wanted to turn their camera on and we can get a photo. Thanks. And actually, Justin, we're ending with, and Aaron, we're ending with potentially, you know, a future topic for a webinar, which is what worked and how was it received. So thank you for leaving on that. That's a great one for us to put into the roster for upcoming sessions. If you have any questions, you can certainly email them to us and we can provide some answers later.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Justin, and thank you to everyone who's here with us. Enjoy your evening.